Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining our virtual presentation. My name is Nicholas Bascugnan-Wiley. I'm a PhD student in sociology at Northwestern University in Illinois.
And I'm Matthew Jungsuk Howard. I'm a PhD student in communication, rhetoric, and digital media at North Carolina State.
Well, we are very excited to talk to you a little bit today about our project, our paper, and gather some questions from you for the live meeting or virtual meeting. We're going to share a PowerPoint and talk through some of the main ideas of our paper, which we are developing. And it's a collaborative autoethnography titled Memory as a Field Site, Making Sense of Empanadas and Doenjangjjigae. And what we did is we grouped together this idea of memory as a field site. So in the main paper, we argue that remembering is field work, just as memory is a field site. And we're basically drawing on this idea that there's a lot of potential for exploring the past and making sense of the past through different forms of memory elicitation, different memory elicitation techniques that would be useful for autoethnography. And we see this somewhat in memoirs and fiction writing, but not as much in the social sciences. So we're trying to offer an avenue to explore that. So we're going to get into what exactly we mean by that and what we did in a couple minutes. But this is the main contention, that remembering is fieldwork just as memory is a field site. So we're drawing on several core concepts that help us understand how memory can serve autoethnography. The first comes from memory studies and is the contention that memory is at once collective, political, and mobile. And there are several both famous collective memory works and newer works that have pushed this idea that memory itself is not a fixed version of the past, but rather an ongoing and therefore political creation of the present in the form of memory. So we think that memory is integral to how we do research and therefore integral to how we do autoethnography. We want to bring memory into autoethnography, and therefore we offer some different suggestions of how to do that in the paper through different memory elicitation techniques. Now, there's very famous works on the connection between the senses and memory, particularly through food. And here we're talking mostly about Proust, Saramatakis, Sutton, who've written about how everyday material and sensory stimuli allow for different connections, both emotional, affective, in the sense of understandings, feelings that come from different memory elicitations. So our project centers on the technique of cooking, or taking food as central to the project. And we're drawing off a very small but growing body of work on cooking as a form of inquiry. And these authors mentioned here do a very beautiful jobs in their own work of exploring different recipes, traditions, cooking techniques as they connect to their own individual identities in terms of race, gender, sexuality, etc. And so drawing on this form of inquiry in order to try to center memory in our work, we came up with this idea of memory as a field site, and both decided to take on a project centered on this idea.
Yeah, and we engaged in this process basically by saying, okay, we're both second generation mixed race dudes. We'll sort of go in and basically cook something that we felt was carrying a lot of symbolic significance for our non-white halves, right? So Nick made empanadas and I made Doenjangjjigae. And we cooked these things and ate them and sort of thought about our recipes. And while we were doing these sort of three processes here, we recorded our reflections, our memories as we went, and also sort of jotted down some post recording reflections as well. Then we came back together and did some joint synthesis of our experiences and took our big takeaways together, and we're presenting those to you today.
Yes, Matt's right. We both took our own paths and then came back together. And in a way, this creates two case studies of this memory as a field site in action, which we're only going to have time to briefly mention or describe to you today, but are happy to answer more questions about exactly what it entailed. And as Matt mentioned, I'm a second generation Chilean American, and I, for my portion, made empanadas, a dish that is very central to Chilean traditions, particularly around the holidays, celebrations of national independence, and one that I remember vividly from my childhood. So I undertook this venture of making empanadas in order to try to engage with some of the memories I had around it and see what came out as I cooked. I started by buying ingredients that reminded me of the ingredients I used to use making this as a kid, watching my grandmother and my mother make this dish, and then ended up drawing from different sources, different inspirations to make the final product, and then consuming it myself and with my partner. So in this process, I talk a lot about the material and affective responses I had to, for instance, cutting up onions, mixing meat, putting things on the stove, the sound of things, on the stove grilling or baking. Also, different forms of the recipe that I had from my mother, my grandmother coming together. And as I made this dish, several memories around class and gender, things that, as Matt mentioned, were pertinent to my experiences with my Chilean identity emerged. And to give you one example, I felt sort of inauthentic or artificial in the fact that I was using the recipe, the family recipe for the meat or what goes inside the empanadas. They're stuffed with raisins, olives, onions, and more. But I was drawing from allrecipes.com, which is kind of your stereotypical classic basic website for the dough. And in using this recipe, I felt kind of inauthentic. How was I, supposed to be able to connect this to my Chilean identity if I got it from Google, and if my grandmother and mother made this differently? So in this process, I grapple with some of those feelings that emerge from making empanadas, some of the successes I feel I had, some of the hardships, some memories about family and collective gatherings, some memories about frustrations and places where I didn't feel I belonged. And through the process of smelling, tasting, feeling the ingredients and the final project, a lot of these memories came to life. So I don't have too much time to explain more examples, but as I mentioned in the live gathering, I'm happy to talk more about it.
Yeah, I think that all recipes example is a really nice place to sort of transition and pivot into my side of things. Nick brought me on a little later on in the project, so I had the privilege of getting to see kind of some of what he was doing in his reflections before I got to work on mine. And I decided to make Doenjangjjigae. I'm a half Korean American, and for me, Doenjangjjigae, which is kind of this like soybean paste based stew, it really was the thing I was asking for when I asked my mom to make Korean food for most of my life. And for me, I think I would argue I never understood Asian American studies really until I did this. So this was a really interesting opportunity and a really cool project to be a part of. And really what happened for me was I got the sense that I grappled a lot with varying multifaceted processes of alienation throughout this by engaging with my memories. I was always, at least the way that I was speaking in my notes, a degree removed somewhat from the cooking experience itself. So most of my notes are reflections aimed at the experience of thinking back on those memories, very much in my sort of historian brain way. And one of the interesting things that I came across was thinking about like American sort of public school lunchrooms as kind of platform, kind of in the way Riyanka Singh would talk about platforms here. And the lunchroom in this case was not necessarily as welcoming to many of the Korean foods that I had, because typically Korean meals are made up of rice and a series of banchan or side dishes. So it was logistically a little more taxing to make that portable, I think. And so that was one of the things that I ran into here that was very interesting. The other side of it was the transcription process. I used a program called Descript to sort of voice to text my notes, and Descript is very much on the struggle bus throughout the entire experience. So I would say that the process of inscribing memory and sort of that intersection with digital media was really my big takeaway here, and the way that our sense of and access to memories is mediated by technologies in this way.
So that's a little flavor of what we were working on through this project. We want to come back here to the main point of this argument of memory as a field site, which is to say that this is more of a venue or an invitation for autoethnographers to explore the way that memory informs their field sites, the way it informs the actions that they're involved in during field work, their engagements with others in the field, and to take seriously how those visions from the past influence our interactions in the present, and our emotions, our feelings as we work. From our two examples, we noted that there was a lot of beautiful symmetry, but also several points of differentiation. And so we think this method allows for exploration in different directions rather than one set result. Cooking is a very messy process, and we think that this form of research was too. It took us a lot of energy to translate our ideas, our emotions from the actual cooking experience into words for the paper and into this presentation. But that's part of the process, and we think that's part of the results as well. So to end with a couple of takeaways from what we found, we came across this idea of coalescing selves. A lot of the experiences that we had while cooking weren't necessarily attempts to create our own identities, but rather moments of, for instance, buying ingredients, remembering childhood lunches, that all came together or coalesced into helping us make sense of our past, and therefore understand who we are as selves, who we are as collectives, and how our identities manifest from these different stimuli. Especially as second generation Americans, especially as mixed race Americans, we felt kind of tensions in different ways. Particularly for me, I felt this tension between authenticity and artifice, feeling disconnected from my Chilean family, from my Chilean portion of my identity because of my inability to make perfect empanadas, but also feeling a sense of actual connection to that family and to those identities in different instances of getting the flavor right or sharing it with new friends, making new original experiences. So we floated between these different tensions, and Matt can mention alienation and belonging.
Yeah, for me, I think I got the sense coming out of this project that my understanding or myself emerges at the sort of point of highest tension between alienation and belonging. So on the one hand, we can say that there's sort of the sensual, like, I guess, smell experience of making this food that makes me feel like I'm at home and reminds me of relatives and precious family experiences from my youth. And then there's also the sense of sort of multi-layered processes of alienation that happen in the sort of school lunchroom, where my Koreanness is made more visible by that platform, where you've got your food kind of on display for your friends. There's the sense of alienation that comes with being Korean American and being with your Korean family and not speaking Korean. That was also very prominent. And So for me, I guess there was this sort of like if we took a piece of bubble gum and pulled it apart, that very center section where things are tensest, that's kind of where this, I guess, self coalesced in my mind coming away from this project. So it was a really interesting kind of experience, like working through these reflections and thinking about that alienation and how it moves beyond the memories into the technologies that we use to sort of record them and transcribe them and really translate them. Um, Recognizing that Descript might speak Korean and it certainly speaks American English, but it doesn't speak Korean American was very very much my big takeaway here as well. Um, yeah, so it reveals a lot of things. It lays bare a lot of different facets of our experience that I think we both agree are relevant to sort of our scholarly research.
So we invite you to consider how a different memory elicitation technique might influence your own research, how cooking, for instance, and eating foods relevant to your memories could evoke rich ethnographic detail and analysis. And that's what we have for you today. We'll be happy to take any questions at the live virtual meeting, and we would be happy to share our emails, contacts, and paper if people are interested. So thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you soon.